All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us again at Public Spend Forum for another in our series of webinars on learning the market. I'm Frank McNally, our Director of Learning and Content here at Public Spend Forum, and today we're going to be talking about best practices in public sector spend and procurement analytics with a very special guest, Professor Rob Handfield. And Rob is joining us from, where are you today, Rob? I'm not exactly sure.
I'm in Charlotte today, so.
Fantastic. Rob, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself before we sort of jump in?
Absolutely. So I'm a professor at my university in the Poole College of Management, also executive director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. But I've been working in the procurement space for about 30 years and have spent also some time working with NASPO, the State Procurement Officers Organization, and have also worked with GSA around federal acquisitions. So had an opportunity to work in both the private and public sectors of procurement and acquisition.
Excellent. We look forward to talking with you today and learning from some of your experience working in those sectors. A real quick note about Public Spend Forum for those of you that are unfamiliar with what we do. Public Spend Forum is a market intelligence and best practices platform that services the public sector, specifically buyers and suppliers. Through our market intelligence and best practices platform, we do look to provide government programs, buyers and suppliers with supplier and market knowledge and data, best practices, and improve the work that you do. And then also a global community and network of peers and experts in public procurement, which you can find at publicspendforum.net. It's free to use. It's free registration. We've got a lot of great best practices and tools, and also all the events and webinars that we do, like the one we're doing today. After our hour is up, we feel that you would be able to appreciate why analytics, specifically spend analytics, is a challenging practice. And you'll be able to engage in meaningful conversations about business challenges that you might be looking to solve with procurement analytics or spend analytics. We're going to use those terms probably interchangeably today. Also, we'd like you to be able to construct some clear research questions that will direct your market research into possible solution providers for the procurement analytics that you're looking for. And finally, Rob is going to share a case study on a successful procurement and spend analytic application, and we've got another one that we'll share with you after the webinar is over, and we think these two case studies will give you some practical takeaways you can use on with spend analytics. So, Rob, you've written a book on this topic, right? The procurement value proposition, and the subtitle is The Rise of Supply Management, and you based it on interviews with many CPOs and procurement directors. You discuss, I think, what you say is a noticeable gap between procurement executives' explicit intentions of driving value for the business and then documented results in these areas. Tell us a little bit more about these gaps and what you write about in the book.
Yeah, so this book was something that the co-author and I, Gerard Chick, and I thought about a few years ago, and we said, you know, procurement is always complaining that they're not getting any respect. Right, that they're not getting any engagement from the business, and as we thought about it, we came up with the ideas for this book, and really it's about sort of the key traits that set apart procurement role models above the rest, and the first is the level of engagement, the extent to which they really enjoy stakeholders, not and complaining, but solving their problems. Their ability to really hitch themselves to a business strategy, to support and even advance that strategy. And the third piece is around advanced tools and technologies. And I think that's really the focus of the webinar today is, there's a real gap between, executives' explicit intentions for driving value for the business and the results in these areas. And ultimately, data becomes the basis for decision making. And if you can start to bring data and analytics to these discussions as to facilitate discussions, then you can align decision making, and you can actually drive the right kinds of strategies that result in outcomes that are good for the business, and you get that respect. in the end by building those relationships, supporting the strategy, and then bringing analytics to the table. If that makes sense.
No, absolutely. So we are linking to the book if anybody's interested in getting it. When we send these slides out after the webinar along with the recording, you'll be able to access it through that link. You guys did put this together based on, like I said, a lot of research and interviews with CPOs, and I just wanted to share the spread of kind of where those people came from and the industries that you looked at. But did you also talk to public sector leaders as well, or did you bring any input there?
Absolutely. So, we did speak a lot to, the private sector and talked a lot to them about what was going on in their organizations. And I think, when you look at the public and private sector, they both struggle with data and they both struggle with analytics. And, the question isn't so much, well, how good is your data? Because we always know that the data is never going to be good. It's always going to have gaps. And that certainly is the case in the state government sector, at the city level, and I can speak to the federal acquisition sector. Their data is awful, right? So nobody has really good data. But what was interesting is when we looked across these organizations, we found that regardless of how good or bad their data was, regardless of how far along they were in their journey, they were able to make sense and use data to drive valuable insights, to drive different kinds of value-based decisions. And the point is, it's not about the data, although the data would be nice if we had good data, but it's much more around, how do we use data to drive better decisions, and how do we use analytics to drive better decisions, if that makes sense as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and is it worth sort of just defining what we mean by spend or procurement analytics as opposed to just normal analytics? Is it all the same, or does it deserve a definition?
Well, I think procurement analytics, the first thing when you talk about procurement analytics, people think about spend, right? Well, sure, but spend analytics is really about what happened in the past. It tells you how much we spent on what things. It's not very forward-looking. It's not very dynamic. So I think we have to extend our thinking of procurement analytics as, what goes beyond that? How do we look at risk? How do we look at opportunity? How do we look at, value streams that can be improved to drive cost out? How do we drive at growth, both top-line growth, and how can procurement help support that top-line growth? And from a federal or state or government procurement or acquisition point of view, how do we achieve the outcomes that are really important to the government, to the stakeholders within that government? How do we support the different agencies? How do we support their objectives in a cost-effective manner? So you really have to think about ways that you can support it from an acquisition point of view, not just, oh, well, we have a target of cost savings we want to hit. That's not much of a target. That's not much of a goal in my mind.
So spend analytics probably inform procurement analytics in your definition. And I think you talk a lot about in our conversations leading up to this webinar about the amount of data that organizations have and how there actually is a journey from the amount and availability of data, good or bad, to the ability to pull out actionable intelligence from it. And I think it's insightful to talk about sort of the evolution of analytics in the organization. And I think you have a great progression here. So I'll just sort of navigate as you start with sort of analytics 1.0, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the framework of analytics, sort of the guru or the founder of the analytics movement was Tom Davenport. And he documented it in his book on analytics. In fact, he has a group called the International Institute of Analytics, IIA, and I've done some writing for them. I'm on their faculty that focuses on this evolution. But if you think about it, analytics started sort of with mainframes, right, where you had, these big, large machines with, huge amounts of data, and they were, they primarily provided some decision support. You could generate reports, and in fact, some of the early statistical applications, SAS and SPSS, were using these structured databases through about 2000. And then we started moving to what we call Analytics 2.0, where we started collecting data from multiple sources. So we had consumer data, we had barcodes, we had SKUs, we had then started the evolution of social media, on video streaming. So now we had this more and more data that was coming at us through all of these different social media and different. And that sort of led to this area of these object-oriented databases. And that's where we started to talk about big data. The joke, of course, was, big data, small math. We didn't really know what to do with this data. And today, I think what we're seeing is not only do we have more data in Analytics 3.0, it's coming from multiple sources. It's coming from embedded sensors in objects. We're able to actually look at it in real time because of cloud computing. We're able to visualize it instantaneously, again, through mobile applications. We're able to simultaneously combine databases about our supply chain, about what's happening in terms of our geography, disasters and news feeds. And, this huge computing power has allowed us to stream this data, in real time when we need it. Again, I think that the challenge is we don't really know what information to look at. We're information overload. And I think that's where organizations are struggling, is how do we take all this data and how do we use it to make better business decisions or better government decisions, as the case may be.
No, that's interesting. So the increasing amount and availability of data and big data, right? Big in air quotes. I was at a conference in 2010. It was on learning analytics, but analytics on the same. And I was joking with another attendee about okay, what's the threshold for when data becomes big? And that was in 2010. Today, 8 years later, I imagine whatever definition we could come up with in 2010 would be, 8 times what it is today, or 8 times less than it is today. So, I mean, what is the threshold for big data in your opinion? Is there one? Is that even an operative question?
It's interesting. I heard another statistic that 80% of the world's data has been generated in the last 3 years. Right.
Oh,
so if you think about that in terms of the exponential rise, it's more and more of it. And with that amount of data, it's just you can start to bring together multiple streams of data. But the key in my mind is taking all this data and not putting it into charts and into tables, but how do you visualize it? How do you put it into a format where you can quickly, explore the information and through artificial intelligence ask questions, query the data that will then produce visualization and graphics. And we're seeing, a lot of programs being able to do that, Watson being one, where now you're accessing the data in real time and you're actually interacting with it. I think that's important to recognize that the human in the loop is still very important.
Right.
Computers can't answer these questions. Only humans can have to ask the questions, and computers can give you answers.
So there is some correlation then, I guess, with it by an organization's ability to glean insights from their data and their maturity, their organizational maturity, but also the tenure of their CPOs. And the chart that you have, I think it comes from the study that shows sort of how the average tenure of CPO in years is multiples higher for a mature procurement organization, and as is the spend under management. How is that impacting sort of just the ability to use spend analytics and procurement analytics to transform an organization?
Well, that's a great question, Frank. And I think, what I was trying to show with this chart, I think is, first of all, you talk about what the average tenure of a chief procurement officer is. And, I think CAPS did a study a couple of years ago, And the average tenure is, 2.3 years, right? And if you think of it, then, you get someone who comes into that role. It's either, they've come out of finance and they're doing their tour of duty as in procurement. The guys in the basement, as people joke, and then they're moving on to other things. But as what we are starting to see is that it's becoming, and when you get CPOs who have a longer tenure, who stay on board, that under their leadership, they can start to drive evolution of procurement because they have a common vision. They have a common view of how things have to occur over time. And with that, they're able to gain access to resources that allows them to drive better control over their data. And if you're just going to go in there and you're going to save some money, yeah, you can go in 2 years. You can always find ways to save a little money. But the point is, to really drive evolution towards a different set of value goals and objectives requires a strong leadership team. And they recognize that it's a process, and it can take several years in some cases to achieve that level of maturity.
I mean, and sometimes too, the trends in the data sets aren't immediately apparent to someone who maybe has not spent that much time in the job. So, I mean, at 7 years tenure, your understanding of the organization and your ability to see the patterns and the context for those patterns, does that mean the insights that you're deriving and what you can act on are a lot stronger?
Absolutely, because and I think the key difference here, Frank, is that you're getting managers and leaders who are now reaching out to stakeholders. They're developing familiarity, and with familiarity becomes you get trust, and that also applies to the whole set of internal relationships that executives have with their IT group. And I think in the next slide here we talk about managers and IT groups, and the point is that if you always think of IT as the enemy, like, oh, IT doesn't support us, they don't get it, they're old school, they know how to build databases, but they can't help us build an analytics platform. And then the IT people say, well, we don't know what they want, we don't understand what they want, their data is horrible, they can't even describe what information they need, and by the way, too many IT, projects going on as it is, then yeah, you're not going to get much progress. But what we are starting to see is procurement people are saying, look, IT, help us with our platform, but then we're going to create our own analytics teams. We'll bring in our own team of subject matter experts that can extract data, and we can start building it ourselves. We can start building our own visualizations, our own graphics, our own ways of looking at that information. And increasingly, you're now seeing the need for someone who understands a little bit about IT, who understands quite a bit about procurement, and they're able to bridge that gap and really start to make that happen. And we did a study last year, and we're seeing more and more companies are doing that. They're building their own internal procurement and supply chain analytics teams that are able to work with data and information and not rely on IT to provide that for them.
Well, I mean, that goes back to the context, signal versus noise, just by your understanding for what a procurement system is or what your data is suggesting. I mean, sure, you could dump all of your data into an analytic tool and it's going to show you patterns, but if you don't have the business context and acumen for procurement, then you're not really going to be able to read those tea leaves. So even if you're not an executive out there, you're just somebody who's interested in this topic, the more you can understand your agency's spending profile, what you buy and why you buy it, then I think some of the analytic outcomes are going to make more sense to you, and you can actually start to bridge the gap between the sort of the manager IT group divide. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that procurement transformation, IT divide is one that exists in every organization. And going back to our procurement value proposition book, one of the most common kind of excuses we heard from people is we said, look, to create a procurement transformation, we need to be able to incredible data and metrics and be able to bring those to the table that allows us to, support a solid business case. Well, the chicken and egg scenario says, but to do that, we need cleansed data. We need good spend analysis. We need contract management systems. We need good metrics. And so unless we can invest in these procurement systems that produces that, we'll never be able to make a business case to be able to generate the budget we need to invest in those resources. So, it becomes a perpetual argument of we can't do one without the other, and we can't build a business case if we don't have the systems. We can't have the systems unless we have the data to build a business case. Well, that's rubbish, because in my mind, you have to start with whatever you have. You have to start with whatever data is available and start to understand at a base level what are the requirements that people have, and then start to build off of that data how you for that particular project. So cutting it into smaller points of view, smaller segments of work, I think, can help drive that. And I think we have to overcome that misconception of we can't do it without data.
What I hear is break it down into little smaller chunks or modules, so you don't have to do the full system build in order to make sense of your data. But you also don't have to have all of your data cleaned before you do a big system procurement, right? I mean, I'm kind of wondering, are these people's literally this is what they believe, or is this just sort of punting? I can't do that until I have the system, and we can't build the system until we have that. How ingrained is it in your experience from your conversations?
Yeah, it's a common excuse, and I think it is a punt. By the way, I think we can't. Our data is horrible. We don't have a good spend analysis. Therefore, there's nothing we can do. That's not an excuse. And I think even if you start someplace, start small, start with the basics, start with the fundamentals. You can move a lot. So let me give you an example. We have a number of case studies here that, if people want to click on those, they can get access to them. But in one case, it was a large insurance company, rather mid-sized insurance company, did not have a lot of data. And it was their legal team that said, we really need to understand our risk exposure on contracts. And so they didn't start with a spend analysis or a procurement system. They started with a contract management system. And when they started, building these contract views of how many suppliers they had by category, how many, sources they had without good contracts. At first, their legal team and their general counsel said, well, we can't believe these numbers. This can't be right. And they said, well, they are. They are. They're directionally correct. Maybe they're not precise. They're pretty close to accurate. And that's when people said, wow, well, we need control over this. We need to invest in a larger system. So building on some fundamentals, building on what's important to the business, you can start small and kind of build on that over time and generate, the organic business case to drive investment in those systems.
Yeah, I mean, it is a journey. I think you're right. You've said this a few times. It is a journey to get to an end state, but it's, there's steps along the way. And so start small, think about what it is you're trying to do. You don't have to solve it all at one pass. And start to have these conversations, I guess, between IT and managers. And we've got a little later in the presentation, which we'll include in our sort of post-event summary, a nice checklist of questions that you can ask, and it's broken down sort of by functional role. Because I think sometimes having these conversations is difficult. It's hard to know what questions to ask and where to start, but you going in the same direction towards the middle aim point. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, in organizations that are successful, they have procurement that are, how do I say, they're sort of curious, right? They're able to use whatever data they have and to be able to mine it to start to drive the right questions that lead to the right insights. And, by partnering with their IT group, they can also say with them, look, we don't need all the data, but can you give us access to some of the data? Can you give access to this particular set of data? And can we extract that and look at it? And with that information, you can start to create visualizations that can drive the right kinds of questions with stakeholders, and that can start to get you moving to the right area. And I think the other mistake people make is they say, well, we need 100% accuracy, 100% visibility. No, you don't need all of it. You need to think about those areas that are most critical to your business and then use it opportunistically to drive, say, a total cost of ownership model, or to drive, a risk analysis model, or to drive, insights into, potential views on waste or on quality issues. And as you get, these kinds of partnerships going, not just internally with IT, but with your supply base, together you can start to pull together the data that you can use to start to drive the right kinds of discussions with your stakeholders, the right kinds of business decisions as well.
I think it's important to point out too, if you're a buyer and maybe you're not having these high-level conversations, but you are supporting a program or a customer who is, be cognizant of that. Be cognizant of, if their requirement isn't perfect early, give them a break and understand that they're probably having conversations that are their own politics involved, and so try not to get frustrated if you're not getting the types of answers you're looking for to, say, develop your solicitation or to put your evaluation plan together. Recall this slide and just understand that IT and managers and leaders are all trying to work together, and maybe there's something you can do as a buyer to facilitate that, but sometimes patience and understanding and just recognizing that we're all human can win the day. So you've got this concept that you talk about as we sort of start to think about more advanced and predictive analytics called innovative data leveraging. And basically from your research, you found that every executive you interviewed was seeking a customized analytical insights package. And so is that sort of how you came about defining this term, innovative data leveraging? And what's the history here?
Yeah, the history of it was, when we started to talk to managers, working in their transformation journey, we found that all of them were able to utilize whatever data they had to try to build, a business case, to try to build insight that could lead to better decision making. And so that's why I call it innovative data leveraging, because it's taking data, whatever data you have, to leverage it in an innovative fashion to kind of drive it into cross-functional engagement that's powered by stakeholder influence through analysis and presentation of data. Now, of course, we would love to have a procurement system that has transactional spend, that has contract management, that has supplier performance measurement. But our analysis also showed that it is possible to do this in just about any type of procurement environment. And that begins with procurement executives conducting working sessions with stakeholders to develop a deep understanding of their business strategy, really understanding what is it you're trying to achieve, and then what are the challenges that you face in executing that strategy, and what role can procurement or acquisition play in helping to shape and support the strategy. So don't start out with your own objectives of, well, we've got a cost savings target. Start out with their problem. And successful procurement leaders are the ones who can effectively articulate the questions that need to be answered as a result of that session, those engagements, and then pursue the data requirements to provide the analysis, insight, and ultimately advice to address stakeholders' business concerns and challenges. And so really that's what we mean is that ability to take information in whatever form we can glean it. In some cases even taking, PDFs taking invoice data and manually scanning it and collecting it and putting it into a format where you can use it. We've seen companies do that. It's required to help build those business insights.
Yeah, I mean, you got like starting somewhere, right? Like that type of exercise would give a foundation for you to build up into something that's maybe a little bit more current, like an analytic on top of your contract management system. So instead of pulling the data out of PDFs, it's basically just being pushed into the analytic, and then this hierarchy that you put together to sort of like describe how innovative data leveraging builds on successive tiers of higher order data is important. But it doesn't matter, even if you had the best data ever and you had automatic data, or it's all plugging in. If you don't know what you're going to do with it, what good is it?
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I think, Frank, this figure here kind of shows the fact that, we all work off of a foundation of, ultimately ERP is part of of every organization. You can't say, well, our ERP systems don't code things properly. Because ultimately, when you look at, say, the general ledger, no one really understands how the general ledger codes information. I mean, to give you an example, I worked with a large financial services company, and they coded, travel spend was under business development in the general ledger, right? So there's some nonsensical ways of coding stuff in these ERP systems. And even then, that information is sort of historical in nature. It's looking backwards. But if we can then find a way to actually kind of scrape off what is at least, how much are we spending, who are we spending it with, what contracts do we have? That gives us at least an as-is current state of where we are. And then over time, if we can start to take that information and layer over it, contract data, workflow capture data, that can start giving us, some real-time feedback for what's going on. Again, it doesn't happen everywhere, but it can be at critical junctures, those critical points in the process where we need to understand what's happening. And as we build on this capability, we can start to do, sort of this predictive type of analysis. And that's where, some people may do some self-serving of data, helping themselves to data they need to build, statistical models in response to specific stakeholder requirements. And that can then lead to some very interesting kinds of insights. So, to use an example, a large CPG company decided to focus on their 10 biggest suppliers that make up 80% of their spend. And they focused on those 10 big suppliers, prioritizing and creating visibility of spend by region, starting to look at the scale opportunities, started to look at contract volumes, and very quickly we're able to get access to around 80% of their spend by focusing just on a small subsegment of their supply base. So, and then you can start to pull information from all these different sources and consolidate it in what they call a data lake or data warehouse, where then you can start to protect the data. It becomes a source of truth, and you can start to access it and build it over time as your core set of analytics that you can use to drive analytic types of projects. Let the other systems operate behind the scenes, but keep this single source of truth, this data warehouse, separate and only for your use only.
Right. I know. I mean, what I like too about this sort of foundational structure, that it harkens back to your earlier point about the chicken and the egg. Whether you need the system before the transformation or vice versa. What you really need is just to get started, iteratively taking small steps, and then you'll build, over time on that foundation. I also think it's funny that we use the term data lakes to call that a database. So 5 years ago we had databases. Now 5 years later we have data lakes. Will it be data oceans one day, or do you think we're going to stick with that this body of
Well,
work?
you know, I've heard the term data swamp as well, which is when you start to, you know, throw all kinds of data into your data lake and you don't know that, you can't verify the source of it. So now you have a bunch of junk in there and it becomes a swamp. So you know, you have to make sure your data lake stays pristine and the water's clear and you're not throwing a bunch of garbage in there.
Data bouillabaisse. I like it. So, okay, this is I like this slide a lot because it's talking about, and I think we're starting to operationalize a little bit and help people think about, all right, now how do I think through an innovative data leveraging process starting with a business problem and then ultimately understanding where my metrics are going to take me. So break this down for us because I think there's 3 buckets here that are nice and sequential for people to consider when they might get started on something like this.
That's exactly right. And going back to the data lake, you know, you start with a single project and you build data around that project. And then, you know, over time, as you get more inquiries from people, you start to build out the data lake based on this process. But, you know, in every case where we found a successful analytics center of excellence in procurement, you know, we found that it all started with stakeholder engagement to really understand, you know, what again is the nature of the problem, you know, and really an improved appreciation of what procurement can do to help the business. And a lot of business people think that procurement's all about just buying stuff, right? But increasingly we're saying that, you know, procurement needs to be seen as a trusted advisor, and they have access to a broader set of data to shed light on business problems and can help people better run their business. Since so much of everything is outsourced. I mean, you know, GSA outsources everything to produce anything internally. And so, you know, that initial engagement is key because that's where you start is understanding the question. And it's sort of like the scientific method. If you don't get the question right, you'll never get the right answer. And the question, getting the right question can lead you to the right data. And that can then lead you to what they call hypothesis development, which says, you know, what are we trying to solve? What is the problem? And if we have the problem, then what is the hypothesis that A leads to B, that C leads to D? And as we develop those hypotheses, that naturally and organically leads us to think about, well, what data would we need to test that hypothesis, right? And then once you start asking that question, you could say, well, we don't have that data, but then do we have other data that might also shed light on that hypothesis? Do we have proxy data? Do we have other information that we can get access to and that we may not, you know, have ever looked at before, but that it resides somewhere in the organization? And if we can access it and download it and cleanse it and use it in this statistical analysis, and we can then start to drive metrics or insights from that leads us to a better outcome, then we've got a win, right? Then we've got our first win, and now you're on the road to continuous improvement by using analytics to drive better business decision making.
I'm going to make a bold statement. Tell me if you agree. Is there anything more important than the hypothesis development in this process? Like, I mean, if you can't get that right, you're just walking around in the dark, bumping into things, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Or you're looking at the wrong question, or, you know, you could be looking under the light for because that's where the data is, right? But if you know you lost your watch out in the dark out there in the swamp, you know, looking under the light isn't going to help. So,
right.
You come to and say, "Well, we've never looked at this before, but we think there might be something interesting there if we can get access to it." And you're absolutely right, Frank. You know, I think until you can get the question right, you're struggling. I think it was Einstein was asked a question one time. They asked him, if you were on a desert island, and you were given 1 hour, to figure out what the meaning of life was, what would you do? And he goes, well, I'd spend the first 55 minutes trying to figure out what the right question was and what the question should be. So getting that question right is fundamental to leading to the right pursuit of data.
Yeah, and plus two, if you don't have your hypothesis or your question, then how will you know if you've solved it? I think, which is what Einstein was trying to say.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't know if you ever read this book. It's a little older, but Nate Silver wrote The Signal and the Noise, and I read it, and I always found that to be really, especially with the evolution of data analytics. But the point being, you're going to find a lot of false positives. You're going to find a lot of things that look like they might define something, but having a really solid business hypothesis that's based on a business challenge will let you separate sort of signals, which are real things you want to follow, from noise, which you may think are useful because they look pretty and they meet the trend, but aren't actually defining that hypothesis. So, right. I don't know if you did familiar with that book or not, but.
I'm not, but it brings to mind another example, another case study that we saw here, which, this was again a large cereal manufacturer actually, and they started with a very simple question from their stakeholder, and their stakeholder asked, what is the best way to source sugar? And you think, well, sugar, right? And that's got to be a fairly simple question. What's the best way to buy sugar? But actually, when they started looking into it, it was a very complex question, and they had to start pulling data on not just global sugar prices and indices. They started looking at, what's the best way to ship it? What are the best sources of sugar? How do we, distribute it to our different manufacturing locations? Do we buy it in pallets? Do we buy it in bags? Do we buy it in container loads? And it became a very interesting question that drove a lot of complex analysis that led to a total cost of ownership model that led to some significant cost savings. So, simple question like, what's the best way to source sugar, in bulk, in pallets or other channels, results not just in, cost models and analysis, but actually led to significant modified business processes that were then required to achieve that outcome. It led to better scorecards, better metrics. There were a ton of opportunities that came up once they started with that simple initial question of how to source sugar. So I think this where you can lead to some incredible insights.
That is maybe easier said than done. I don't think it's a difficult process. It will take some thought and some conversations, and we want to help you have those conversations to come up with your business challenges and your hypotheses. So Rob's kind of identified some in some of his materials. We have put that into a nice sort of downloadable that you can get. We'll send it out in the materials after this webinar concludes, and you'll sort of be able to download this sheet and see, okay, if I'm talking to so-and-so people or if I'm having these types of conversations, these are the questions I'm gonna ask about. And it's just really nothing more to help you than to help you get those conversations right so you can get the business challenge and the hypothesis correct. So look out for that in an email after this webinar concludes. So you have said the predictive analytics are sort of at the highest point of the analytical highly evolved form of IDL, innovative data leveraging. What are some of the different types of predictive analytics that you think are relevant for procurement?
So I think there's a number of areas where procurement can really help support business decisions, or in the case of public spend, agency decisions. So one is demand forecasting, and we know that forecasts are never accurate, but they can be better, right? And so if we can start to understand what are the big drivers for demand, and how does that impact all of our spending, and how does that impact our budget, and if we can help, particularly in public spend areas, if we can help people understand their budgets, and if they're going to see a budget shortfall, and how can we help them with future budget shortfalls, or how other factors like inflation or labor or industry shortage, how those things impact their organization. That's a huge opportunity. I wrote a blog recently. There's likely going to be a huge shortage of electronic components that's driven by the digitization of just about everything, and we're already seeing lead times extend. So that means that costs are going to go up, and availability will also be a problem. So understanding that is important. In terms of strategic sourcing, helping them understand, who are the best suppliers. What suppliers have a track record of good performance. Which ones do we recommend to use under different types of conditions based on, cost, quality, service, delivery, capacity, and then helping them to predict, if you have future projects out there, let us work ahead of you to, do some market research on what's happening out there, and not just wait till the last minute to drop an RFQ. Evaluating risk, understanding, what is the ability of these suppliers to perform, especially on these major projects. If you look at defense projects, right, getting early engagement of suppliers to help build out a better statement of work, a better technical specification, a better performance specification. Again, all of that is okay by the FAR. You're able to do that, yet, very often companies are reluctant to engage suppliers, which in my mind is a mistake. And then also looking at price volatility. What do we see going on in the marketplace? What are the future, projected prices for these different types of categories that you're looking at? And can we better bundle, our requirements in such a way, maybe across multiple agencies or multiple stakeholders, to try to drive, better pricing over a longer extended period of time if we have common requirements or common standards. So these are all, number of opportunities that, procurement can drive real value back into the organization, can drive better business cases, better returns, if they bring the right data to the table and if they're engaged early enough in the process.
Yeah, this is some really high-speed stuff here. But I think the cautionary note, of course, is predictive analytics. So what it takes a lake, right? I mean, there's a lot of data that you're going to need in there. And I think this slide, I think, was just meant to really show how much you would need. And I don't think this is not achievable. I mean, I think a lot of organizations can get there, but it probably takes time. I don't know if there are other points you wanted to make about the sort of the data warehouse capability or enablement for predictive analytics.
Well, yeah, I think, it does a couple things. One, it does take time. It also takes focus, right? So it does require that you can utilize and access, contract data, spend data. You can start to, pull this data again into a warehouse or lake where you can have it available and use it for, business intelligence and possibly, statistical or regression analysis that you need to explore major trends. Right? So you need to have a foundation of data. And ideally, you'd like to have all of the data, but realistically, you have to understand what data we think would be most useful and then start to isolate that information in a way that then makes it accessible and that you can use. And, very often, it means you have to be sort of opportunistic to, if you see an opportunity to grab data that you think might be useful down the road, you sort of, jump on it and put it into a format where you can cleanse it and use it. The other piece, of course, is data governance. You have to make sure you cleanse the data because the worst thing that can happen is if you show your information, you show and people don't believe you, right? And so you have to be able to show that the information is believable, it's from a trusted source, and you may get pushback. You may still get pushback that people say, I don't believe that. I don't believe we're spending that much. I don't believe we're using that many suppliers. And, you know, you may at some point go back and say, well, actually, yeah, this is truthful. This is not made up information.
Yeah, the data governance piece is probably a webinar unto itself, but yeah, making sure that it is kind of garbage in, garbage out, right? There's no data analytic tool that's going to take bad data, spin it into gold, and send you on your merry way.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned.
Exactly. And I think, you know, if you think about some common types of data, you know, it'd be good if you could get past performance data on suppliers, you know, understand, you know, the distribution of your spending, who it's with. There's a lot of metrics here you can attach to different sectors. If you can collect quality data, even like log customer complaints, or, you know, what's their record against SLAs in your contracts, and monitoring that information. Sometimes you can even get suppliers to collect that data for you, and you know, understand and be able to collect it over time. Responsiveness, you know, how many suggestions they make every year, what's their on-time delivery. You know, this is all important information that your stakeholders really care about. So whatever is important to your stakeholders, you should be thinking about data that can help support, you know, insights and supplier performance against those expectations.
Exactly. I mean, and if you are, maybe you are a little bit more along down the road in your journey to sort of predictive analytics or just spend analytics in general, there are suppliers out there that offer packaged solutions and package applications, and especially for industries like supply chain, like procurement, that already sort of understand to some degree the types of data that you need. Now, there does need to be governance as you put the data into these package analytic applications, but I think what I'm trying to say here is, you know, you can find some companies that understand the business already and can kind of accelerate your trajectory. We have written about them in a report we released last fall on the marketplace for public sector business intelligence solutions, and we'll include a link to download that. It's free in the post-webinar materials. But eventually, we're going to have all these suppliers sort of available to folks in a database, make it really easy for you to sort of find and query and filter for the precise types of suppliers that you're looking for. So, point being, they are out there. These spin analytics solutions, they're out there. They're things that can get you a little bit further along in a quicker manner if you know your hypothesis and if you have a pretty solid understanding of the data that you have in-house.
You know, I would urge people to be sort of, you know, platform agnostic. In other words, you know, I think it's important that you try out different platforms. You know, don't wait around for your IT people to approve it. Just say, hey, you know, let's do a pilot. You know, we'll share with you some of our data. Let's load it on your platform and see how useful it is, and try different systems. You know, by all means, these organizations are you know, happy to do pilots with you. In most cases for free, and you can get an idea of how they'll work for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Pilot them, but then too, when you make the commitment to go with one, make sure you have you understand how you're going to get your data out of that. Like, don't get locked into one solution. That's being platform agnostic. That's a really important point. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think you wanted to share with us a few of your predictions. You're going to put on the prognosticator cap. Where is predictive analytics going in the future?
Yeah, so these are, you know, five predictions that we wrote about last year, that predictions around predictions, if you will, predictions around predictive analytics. So I think, you know, one of the things that we'll see is that spend analytics will increasingly become in real time. I mean, we won't be downloading, you know, Excel spreadsheets and creating graphs and putting them on PowerPoint. I think in the future, you know, with real-time analytics, with the cloud, we'll be able to simply pull up a screen and see exactly how much we're spending and who we're spending it with in real time. And I think, why we won't have to just ask the question of, well, where does that data come from? We'll know it's real data and it's what's happening right now. I think we'll also start to see, much more focus on incident prediction. It won't be about trying to, think about risk or monitoring risks, but understand where and where supply chain are the biggest areas that we have to monitor that can, really drive, drive big shutdowns. What they call it the kill shot, right? What is the one node in your supply chain that if it goes down, the whole supply chain goes down? And being able to really effectively manage, those key nodes in your supply chain. I think we're going to see individuals that are going to be recruited who have a combination of analytics and business capability, and that's something that NC State and the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative has. Almost all of our supply chain projects with industry and government are analytics driven. They're using a variety of visualization tools and analytic tools to really start to look at what are the skills, and individuals particularly coming out of school are really armed with a lot of these skills, and even though they may not have a lot of subject matter expertise, I think they've got some great analytical skills in your organizations. I think sustainability, corporate responsibility, diversity, these are all integral to the sourcing process. And we will increasingly have to track our spend in these areas and be able to prove it. We're working on another project on bio-based products. I'm talking with someone from GSA about what they're doing to monitor that in their FPDS system. So I think the same thing will apply to environmental footprint, labor rights, diversity, conflict minerals. All of these things are now something that we're going to have to be accountable for. And then finally, I think the biggest opportunities are not so much in the contract negotiation, but I would say the biggest opportunities are in post-award contract management, where we work together to drive opportunities for cost reduction that will drive the right level of engagement and activity. And we've held a couple of workshops with partners, and we're seeing that's a huge opportunity to improve the process, to improve communication, information flow that can lead to significant improvement outcomes. So those are sort of the areas I think are key going forward. I'd be happy to entertain others that you think might be out there as well from our audience up there.
I'm going with data oceans. I think that's going to be a thing. Well, hey, listen, we're sort of bumping up against the end of our hour here, and we weren't going to go through this case study anyway, but we were just going to preview it real quick since it was from a public utilities case, and you've already written it up. We're going to include it in our post-event materials, and you've already shared quite a few insights from case studies that you've been involved in. But as sort of folks are taking off here, because I know it's 3 o'clock, what were some of the key things that you wanted to make sure folks understood, and either from this case study or anything that you've talked about today?
I think, one of the things that you see out there is you don't have to think about just internal data. You can also think about external databases that are out there. Mm-hmm. And this is a big public utility that want to understand, how does supply management contribute to the local economy? How does our spend impact the local economy? And so they looked at something called economic impact analysis, and they looked at how much their spend was on the community. They looked at the indirect spend. They also identified, what projects they had planned, and they were able to come up with a very, very large number that showed not just their direct spend in the community was important, but all of the jobs and economic impact that they had as a result of that on the community was massive. And for a public utility, that's the kind of information that they think is really important to look at in terms of their contributions to the community beyond just providing them with energy.
Nice.
That's information.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, I really appreciate your time today. I know you're busy and got a lot going on, so thanks for taking an hour and even in the preparation work we did to put this together for our audience. If anyone does have questions for Professor Handfield, they can ask them. I can sort of share them with him over email, and we can get answers to those. So pop them in the chat, email me, frank@publicspendforum.net. And we'll get them answered. But I think this is just sort of the start of our spend analytics journey. We're going to do a good bit more on this topic with help from you, Rob, and the resources you've done, maybe another webinar down the road.
Happy to do it. Really enjoyed doing it today with you, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and look out for that email that'll be coming soon. It's going to be jam-packed with a lot of great insight and useful tools from the webinar. Thanks again, Rob. Have a great afternoon. And everybody, we will talk to you next time.
Have a great day. Bye.